The old house on Maple Street slept in the heat like a patient after a fever. I can still hear its slow, certain breath when the summer afternoons stretched long enough to soften the edges of everything. The doors, the stairs, the world outside that seemed not to notice us at all. It was just after the cicadas began to call us by name. Back then, when I was a child with a sun-bleached shirt and hair that refused to learn its place. The attic door faced the hallway like a patient door to a quiet room, and when the sun sank down and the house turned a pale gold, the latch gave a soft sigh as if it remembered every scrape, every child who had pressed their ear to it to listen for something they could not name. We were two sisters in that summer, June and me, and the house seemed to expect us. June believed the house had secrets to tell, and I believed in her faith more than I believed in anything else. Even in the way the kitchen window kept catching the light as though it were the mouth of some small, patient animal waiting to be fed. Our grandmother, a woman who wore her grief like a shawl she never shrugged off, had left us a ritual we kept because it felt lighter than fear. A plate of bread on the sill at dusk, a glass of water beside it, and the whisper of a name spoken 3 times into the dim corners of the room where the shadows liked to linger. June's name was a bright coin to flip in a laundry day afternoon. We had memorized where the light would land first on the oak table, and we learned to pace our speech with the creaks of the old boards. We spoke June's name with the same care we used when we watered the geraniums on the back stoop, as if saying it once more might coax her to return and tell us what the house remembered that we forgot. The summer of our ritual did not feel like a storm would come to ruin it. It felt like the air itself had a secret to tell, and wished to tell it only to us. The attic floor bore its own languages in the dust-faint footprints that did not belong to us. A violin string left taut in a case we did not own. A small moth that kept circling the bare bulb, as if it had forgotten it was a moth and remembered it was a watcher. The house offered us its ordinary ghosts, the sort that do not frighten you until you have learned to listen to what they are trying to tell you. June's voice, when it came with the wind from the stairs, did not frighten me at first. It was a tremor, a quivering thread of sound that braided itself with the clock's patient, regular pulse. She spoke as if she stood right beside me, and then slid away to lean her shoulder against the doorframe and say nothing for a long moment. The ritual demanded nothing dramatic, only a ritual's patient repetition, bread that would grow stale if forgotten, water that would forget its thirst if not kept company, a name spoken with a level voice that would not betray the tremor in the heart. That summer, June vanished. It did not vanish like something burned to ash or swept away by a flood. It dissolved, as if the room had gathered her and decided not to let her go again. The plate remained, the water stayed, but June did not reappear the way one might reappear after a walk down a familiar lane. The house did not howl, but it exhaled in a way that suggested it understood more than it would ever tell us. We returned to the routine in the months that followed, though the routine had begun to feel more like a tether than a bridge. The attic was still a room that remembered, and the walls wore their years as carefully as we wore our own skin. The house's breath grew deeper, slower, and if the summer had not changed, I had changed enough for 2. I learned the calendar can be a trap as surely as a net, that time is sometimes a patient thief who leaves behind a ledger of small losses, a laugh that lands too softly, a plan that dissolves in your mouth before you can swallow it, a painting you swear you could step into if only your feet remembered how to walk the way they used to. The years did not erase what the ritual did to us, only sharpened it to a fine, invisible edge. My sister, who survived our childhood by a single breath, grew cautious with me. She would not permit us to speak June's name in the evenings unless the room was dark enough that the colour of the furniture could be mistaken for someone's memory. And I, who should have learned to outgrow superstition, found in the house a stubborn sentiment that the past was not something we left behind, but something we kept within reach. A bright coin in the pocket we could pull out whenever the world grew too heavy. In my own life, I forgot how the attic's dust felt on my skin, and how a house will always remember more than you do about your own footprints. I moved away when I grew tall enough to realize a person can carry a memory like a suitcase and still pretend it's not heavy. I loved other towns, other rooms that promised new beginnings with new noses to smell the rain in. But no matter where I went, Maple Street remained a small hinge on which my life turned. The memory of June, a quiet gravity that pulled me back toward the place I had once learned to speak to in the dusk. Now, after many years, I am old enough to understand how a house ages the way a person does. Slowly enough that you barely notice until you stand in a corridor and realize you have become the corridor, and the corridor has learned your steps by heart. I return to Maple Street with a daughter who does not know the weight of the heat, and a son who asks questions about the quiet things we do not name. They carry in their pockets the little surges of fear we learned once to live with, the same fear that makes a house breathe a bit longer when you walk toward it, the fear of a name spoken too many times into a shadow. I go back to the attic as though the door were a thin seam in a fabric I would rather not tear, but always must. The circle of chalk remains on the floor in the remembered dust, the chalk's white powder like a frost on the boards in winter, when the world outside seems to forget it can be cold. I kneel and lay my fingers on the chalk, tracing the circle as if I am tracing the line of a vow I once made and forgot to keep. The photograph of June sits in a corner where the light refuses to stay long enough to make a thing look ordinary. Her hair, a shade too bright for a memory, curls across the edge of the frame as if it could step out and tell me who she was when she stood here with us that long, sun-drenched afternoon. The ritual's bread, long since stale, still rests on the sill in its imagined future, the plate dry as a bone now, a memory pretending to be a supper. The water's glass sits half dry, with a small ring of dust around its rim, the house's own reminder that even what we give it returns in altered form. When I whispered June's name, the air shifts in the